Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you for spending part of your Constitution Day with us. My name is Anastasia Mann. I am the director of SPIA in New Jersey, which stands for the School of Public and International Affairs in New Jersey. Here at the Public Policy School, and very delighted to be welcoming you here. This program is entering its second full year here at Princeton, and it really represents the vision of the Dean Amol, her commitment to the state of New Jersey and to applying the theory and practice of public policy as we pursue it here through research and teaching and outreach to our community, where the community is the whole state of New Jersey. So at SPIA in New Jersey, we work with partners statewide, learning from and with them, and our students learn from and with them, and we find that it's an extremely fruitful exchange of experience and expertise, and that is very much the vein in which we bring you this program today. So there are Constitution Day events happening all over this campus. I think ours is the best, so very quietly. We're delighted to have our guests here today who will be introduced to you momentarily. It's my job to introduce Thelma Carrera, who is the program manager here at SPIA in New Jersey. And Thelma comes to us from the Division on Civil Rights at the state. And prior to that, Thelma was a policy specialist in the office of our Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. She has a degree in social policy from the University of Pennsylvania. And she brings her wisdom and expertise to this program, as well as her experience of being a Jersey person, having really come up through a lot of the institutions that we are about to engage with. Some of those things could also be said for Brandon McCoy, who is a policy fellow here at SPIA in New Jersey. The policy fellows are people who are kind of a brain trust for the program, because Princeton hasn't done anything like this in many, many years. And so Brandon is also a son of New Jersey. He was educated at TCNJ. Who knows what that stands for? College of New Jersey. Very good. Right up the road, as with Thelma, undergrad at the College of New Jersey. So really some of New Jersey's finest right here. Brandon has served in roles at the Federal Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C., but always landed back in New Jersey. He's now the president of the Fund for New Jersey and a professor at the Bloustein School of Policy and Planning. I know. Really impressive roster. So I'm going to kick it to Thelma, who's going to kick it to Brandon, who's going to take it to our Stay tuned. Hold on to your hat.
Hi everyone, my name is Thelma. I am going to ask the room just some questions to just see where everyone in the room is coming from, and get some context. Can you raise your hand if you're from New Jersey? Can you raise your hand if you're from another state in the United States? Can you raise your hand if you're not from the United States? Okay, of these issues, please, actually. Okay, we're good. Of these issues, please raise your hand.
We had planted this as a technical portion, so we were gonna have everybody go on their phones and register which issues you wanted to most talk about. Do you wanna just,
Yes.
yeah,
So there's about 7 or 8 issues here, and just want to garner your interest in the various issues. I'll read them first and then raise your hand, we go back to them. So there's voting rights, reproductive freedom, immigrant rights, housing access, government transparency, civil liberties, including democracy, and economic rights. So if you really, really care about voting rights, I'm going to choose.
what was the first one?
Voting rights.
Voting
You
rights.
really care about it. Okay. If you really, really care about reproductive freedom. Immigrant rights,
Yeah,
housing access,
yeah,
government transparency,
absolutely.
civil liberties, inclusive democracy, and then economic justice. Yeah, I think you gotta give. Thank you. No microphones? Okay. Well, hello, everybody, I'm Brendan McCoy. Again, thank you for coming this evening. I'm coming from class at Boston, so I'm go around. Thank you for joining us on this Constitution Day. As Stacy said, I'm one of the CF fellows here, and it's been a pleasure to see this program get started and grow, and I'm very excited to continue to see it tackle issues that are so crucial to our beloved state, a state that is sort of, a barrel tap at both ends, as has been said, and oftentimes because of the attention on New York or on Philadelphia, we tend to sort of get lost in the sauce a little bit, but it's very important for Princeton to be making space for us to talk about what's going on in our home state. And so it's a pleasure to be with you. I have the privilege of knowing these two folks from a couple of different walks of life, and they've not only been incredible colleagues and friends, but I would say tremendous leaders that have helped me strive to be better in my own day-to-day life. And so I'll introduce them both, but then I'll say a little bit about them as well. And so immediately to my right is Amol Sinha. Amol is a nationally recognized civil rights leader who has dedicated his career to advancing racial justice and holding institutions accountable, as well as promoting and defending rights and liberties. He is the executive director of the ACLU of New Jersey, and there he leads a team of dedicated professionals and guides the organization's innovative, integrated advocacy work, utilizing litigation, policy, public education, and strategic communications to build a more equitable society. Amol took over 2018, 2017, time flies. And as you can imagine, has guided the organization through some very interesting years, especially as we transitioned from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, now to the Biden administration. Has had some major successes and victories concerning criminal justice reform, drug policy reform, voting rights issues, education issues. At the Front of New Jersey, we are very lucky to get to support the ACLU of New Jersey for the work that they do. So it's been a privilege to see them all lead in this way. And also, as a son of New Jersey, you all are the people who are from here stay here. So thank you, Amol. And then Taifa Butler, who, how do I talk about this? So I first met Taifa Butler because I, for a little while, was the president of New Jersey Policy Perspectives. And the sister organization, NJPP, is probably a national network of 42 other state-based sort of think tanks, as we say. And the sister organization in Georgia, Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, at the time that I was at NJPP, was led by Taifa. And I'll just say personal privilege. As somebody who was a young Black professional in a sort of very white space, especially when it comes to tax and budget policy, not a lot of advocates or people of color in those spaces. Seeing Taifa lead made me feel at home, made me feel like I could do the work that I needed to do. And she's as responsible for where I am today as anybody. So she has now, thankfully, at the helm of Dēmos, which is of course based in New York City. She moved from Georgia here to New Jersey, so she's now a New Jersey resident. But it is amazing to have somebody that was leading in Georgia for so long, crucial to the fights there to advance voting rights and voting access, engage with Black Voters Matter, engage with Stacey Abrams and the efforts that she led. That's now be leading Dēmos, an organization that's obviously dedicated to these vital issues at such a crucial time. And so thank you. I didn't read your bio at all, but you stand on your own. And so thank you for being here. We're just gonna have a moderated conversation between the two of y'all, right? Yes.
To the tag, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Brandon. And thank you to Stacy and to Thelma and Princeton and Sophia for inviting us to this conversation. Really appreciate all of you for coming as well. I'll kick us off and then we'll just do back and forth informally. Let me just say a word about Brandon though. I was so I'm from Jersey and I have deep appreciation for music from Jersey. And that includes Bruce Springsteen, and it includes Whitney Houston, it includes Lauryn Hill, it includes a whole bunch of other people. And younger artists often credit those folks for being able to say, like, Bruce Springsteen, Whitney Houston made it okay for us to tell our story, to be from here, made it okay and made it feel as though it was worthwhile to tell our stories from New Jersey. Brandon does that in the policy space. And he makes us feel as though it is okay, not only okay, it is righteous to be from Jersey and to be able to tell the story of policy advocacy leading from here, rather than, so often is the case, us being ignored for the great work that we get to do together. So thank you, Brandon, for being the Bruce Springsteen of the policy world. One of the things that we wanted when we were discussing the format of this, we wanted to make it not stuffy and make sure that there was at least between the two of us a free flow of ideas and conversation, and then open it up for questions from the audience. So Taifa, I'll start, and I would love to learn from you about what does Dēmos do and how did you get to where you are?
Wow. And I too have to give just a huge acknowledgement and appreciation for Brandon. One of the things that, for those of us, and you all are here in the graduate program, hopefully looking to change the world and make some impact on public policy or law or just life, health, wealth, all the things. And to see this young man, young brother, in a state like New Jersey, to have the kind of impact as a policy leader, passing millionaires tax, doing all the things around the fight for 15 and minimum wage, to see those kind of things happen in a state like New Jersey with the kind of political capital you all have, but also to continue to push. And Brandon, I just admire you, your leadership, your brilliance, and I'm just really excited to be closer to you now that I'm in Jersey. So all that to say, Dēmos is a national think tank. We pride ourselves on, as Brandon said, a think and do tank. Really have for the last near 25 years been doing work at the intersection of economic justice, democracy reform, and racial justice. I had a great conversation with our founder, Stephen Hines, who is the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And when he founded Dēmos in 2000, I said, what was the catalyst? Why Dēmos? And he really said that as much as we think about democracy reform and what it will take to build and create an inclusive democracy where everyone has a voice and a say, he said you really can't have a multiracial democracy with unchecked economic inequality. And so the recognition that we have to think about economic equality or inequality to ensure that people can really fully engage in our democracy. And so I've been leading the organization now in my 4th year and had the privilege of serving on the board when Heather McGee was president. Has anyone read the Some of Us? All right, so Heather documents quite a bit of Dēmos' story in the book, and really the work about how systemic racism has been a barrier, right, for an inclusive democracy, how it has harmed everyone. The drain pool, sort of concepts of because of racism and how we have devalued Black and brown people in this country, it has created like inequities across all of our systems, whether it's economy, it's education, it's all those things. And so I was inspired when she was president to serve on the board then, and now have been able to step into this role. And prior to this, I'll just go all the way back to when I was 16 and I was I grew up in Philadelphia, so again, not too far, I'm a Philly kid. And I had an opportunity to serve as city manager when I was 16 years old, when the young people ran the city for a day. I was part of the police athletic league then, and so all their sort of athletes, student scholars, were selected to run the city, and I got to be city manager. It was the second, highest ranking position in the city. I wanted to be the mayor, but I got the city manager gig. And really got a chance to follow and shadow the city manager and see the 11,000 employees he managed, and then to sit and understand what the impact of like city government and how it impacts everybody's lives in the city. And my eyes got really big when I realized it was a strong city manager form of government. So really, I had a great role. But one thing he said to me that has stuck with me throughout my career is, Taifa, the life of a public servant is not about having your name in lights. It's about solving public problems. And I've been a problem solver ever since. And so I went to grad school. I went to school to study politics and economics. Went to grad school at CMU in Pittsburgh and got my master's degree in public policy and management. And have been on this journey to really build like a more just world in my particular role. So that's sort of how I got here. And now really excited that from the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, focused on tax and budget policy, fiscal policy, broadly, economic issues, can really make this connection about the economy, right? And how we always talk of that economic power, the ability to really have agency and control in our economy is connected to political power, which again is about how do we show up and really are able to influence like the political apparatus in our lives. And without economic power, we often see you can't have the kind of political power we need. And so that is something that's really driving my leadership now at Dēmos. So what about you, Amol? How did you get here? Jersey born and raised, and now you're back.
So I was actually born in Philly, but my parents just happened to have their doctor that was at Penn, so they took me there to be born. But I've been in Jersey ever since, and I'll talk about the ACLU real quick, and then I'll talk about how I got to where I'm at. So the ACLU, as folks might know, is a 105-year-old organization. It's been around since 1920. It's a national organization with a nationwide presence. So what I mean by that is that there's an affiliate of the ACLU in every state and district in the United States. There's one in Puerto Rico as well. And we have really boots on the ground in every part of this country. I have the privilege of running the ACLU of New Jersey, which is one of the bigger ACLU affiliates. It's usually like somewhere between 11 and 12 in terms of the size, meaning the 11th or 12th biggest ACLU affiliate. And it is a really remarkable organization, and it's existed for 65 years. So we were founded in 1960. One of the things I actually picked up on recently, because we're about to approach our 65th anniversary, and I've been thinking a lot about our story as an organization. Where did we start? What's the through line? What's the narrative arc? The organization was founded in 1960 for racial discrimination and housing issues. So there were, one of our founding board members was a Black man who was unable to buy a home in a part of New Jersey, in South Jersey, as a result of discrimination. And this group of like-minded folks got together and was like, that's gotta change. And they decided that they would channel their efforts through the ACLU. And they decided to form a chapter of the ACLU and create something that would be enduring and be sort of covering the waterfront of issues. And we've truly evolved into a multi-issue, multi-tactic organization. So we're, of course, working on core civil rights and liberties issues that you all may be familiar with, including, freedom of speech and religion, and working on reproductive freedom and abortion access, and working on criminal justice reform and the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, and equal protection under the law. And we also are one of the first affiliates of the ACLU that have embedded an economic justice bylaw, which says that what good are all of those rights if you do not have shelter or food or a stable wage? What good is your right to vote if you can't provide for your family? So we take very seriously our mission of the ACLU that is shared nationwide, but also this specific goal of providing for access to resources and sustainability for people to be able to be full participants in economic life, which will make them better participants in civic life. So that's the ACLU, and we use a number of different tactics, including, as Brandon mentioned, litigation and legislative advocacy and public policy, but also strategic communications to shift narratives and hearts and minds along the way. We also are figuring out an organizing program and doing some meaningful work in that space. We also do a lot of public education and know your rights trainings and things like that. It's a model that we call integrated advocacy, which is the ability to use all of the tools available to us to achieve whatever the transformational goal might be. Because we realize that no one tactic is going to get there, but maybe a combination of tactics will help us. As for my story, I grew up not that far away from here in Lawrence, New Jersey, which, as folks might know, is equidistant between Trenton and Princeton. And I see familiar faces and folks who have heard me say this story before. But really, living in Lawrence was so eye-opening because, and I didn't have the words as a child to articulate this, but what I realized was how divided our country was just by the stark differences between the towns that I was surrounded by. So you could drive 15 minutes on Princeton Pike and go from a city that is largely Black and economically ignored, with crumbling infrastructure and water issues and issues to access to basic needs. Drive 15 minutes and go to one of the most affluent zip codes in the country, with one of the biggest and most respected institutions in the country, with art and culture and so much luxury to offer. And there was something powerful about seeing in my community spillover from both communities coming into my school district and into my life. And realizing, again, I didn't have the words for this, but realizing that there was injustice in the world and that there was this unjust racial hierarchy in our country. Not only did I not realize how to disrupt it at the time, I didn't realize where I fit in. As a son of immigrants coming from a South Asian family, and it's funny, we live like right in the middle of Lawrence, which is kind of appropriate because of North Lawrence being more in line with Princeton and South Lawrence being more in line with Trenton. We were like right in the dividing line, and I felt, even though I felt loved and as though I had a community, I didn't quite feel that sense of belonging that folks talk about, right? Feeling as though you were truly accepted. And there were little moments, right? Like, of course, any person of color who comes from an immigrant family or any other marginalized community might know bullying and insults and microaggressions. And of course, there were those things that happened in my life. But then also, there was a lot more. There was impacts of systemic racism that I realized were impacting all of us, and that it wasn't just neighbors being mean to each other or kids bullying one another, but there was something at the top that was allowing for a trickle down of hate and fear that led to people behaving that way. And so it wasn't until college and then law school and then working in social justice that I realized how to kind of articulate the problem and also think about the solutions. And the ACLU offers me an opportunity to live my values, break down barriers, address systemic racism, and do some good work with some good people. And we don't do any of our work alone. We get to work in partnership with folks like Brandon and Taifa and others, and we are really just blessed. In my career history, I've worked at the ACLU now for 7 years in New Jersey as executive director. Before that, I used to work at the Innocence Project, which is a criminal justice organization affiliate in New York, working on criminal justice and immigrant rights on Long Island mostly. Thank you. I'll continue the conversation here. But we're facing, it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, we're facing one of the most important elections in our history in just a few short weeks. Taifa, from your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges to our democracy that we should all be aware of as we roll towards this election?
Oh, that's no small question. I think Amol, just in terms of what you shared and in terms of your experience and your upbringing, sort of what you were exposed to and engaged with, and from the separation in the community, I think a lot of times when we look at and we think about, policy choices that are made, and honestly, I said this to my husband the other day, I said, do you think we will ever get rid of racism in this world? Right? Because unfortunately, given our democracy and our economy, like there has been value placed on people's lives, whether or not they have meaning or worth, based on some hierarchy and racial construct of the melanation in their skin. Could we just speak plainly, right? And so when we think about your experience, whether the highway cut through and created this differentiation, or whether people based on policy choices were only able to live in certain neighborhoods, and then their properties were only able to amass sort of appreciation because of the value placed on the people who own the home, that then created the inequity that we see in wealth and health and education. So all of these things come down to how we value human life. And unfortunately, when we think about this particular election cycle, all of the sort of narratives around value are really present today. When you look at or think about some of the political campaign rhetoric, when you think about what policy choices people want to advance, right? They are based on helping others versus other people. And so I think Thelma asked us to even bring this up, but when I think about the anti-Black, anti-immigrant narrative that we see right now that's happening in this country, it is dangerous. And it is not only dangerous to the health and well-being of immigrant and the immigrant community, but it's dangerous in terms of us being able to develop and have the kind of unity that we need around our true values of humanity, but also being able to solve some of the critical problems in our economy. The reason why people are coming to this nation is for opportunity, to have that American dream. And because in other places around the globe that they are experiencing the kind of authoritarianism and restrictions to their health and well-being, people are seeking opportunity in this nation. Now, granted, our immigration system is broken, right? And so there are those problems that continue to need to be solved. But again, we're not solving them because of the values that we're placing on the people who are trying to immigrate. So I think that is fundamentally one of the big issues that we're going to have to really, really watch. Because as I hear now, some of the issues and concerns around violence and the threats that people are experiencing in places like Ohio, the recognition that no matter what happens in November, there are people who are doing the good work of get out the vote and democracy engagement and campaign work to actually ensure that people are they're knocking on doors and encouraging people, regardless of their political affiliation, to make sure they just engage in this civic duty of voting. That are threats of political violence. Not only the intimidation that we see at polling locations, but even just for people who are doing this work. I was talking to a leader in North Carolina who leads a sort of civic engagement group. She's walking around with security because her life is being threatened because of the work that she's doing. So these are the things that are eking and seeping into just our ability to engage fully in our democracy. And then let alone what we saw post 2020 with the big lie, but also we saw state by state this sort of effort to retract from some of the civil liberties. And I want to let our colleague here who knows this work in and out, but just the undermining of our ability to vote. We saw many voter suppression laws come pervasive across the country. And so those are some of the things that Dēmos is watching really closely. We lead a voter purge table that has about 30 some odd organizations as a part of that coalition. And what we're doing is really trying to watch some of these early warnings when states are purging voters in a way that is, again, disproportionately harming Black and brown voters in their states. And so that's been one way that we've been trying to be very vigilant in watching some of these voter practices or election practices in states. And so that, in addition to some of the policies that are concerning us about whatever happens post November, in particular around some of the Project 25 ideas, the 900-page paper that was cobbled together from a host of different think tanks with a political ideology that is really about undermining government and the role of government, and naming some of the things that are in that project around, you know, getting rid of the Department of Education and all of these things are problematic. And I think, and I'm going to kick it to you, because one of the things that I really am sort of conscientious of when we think about post-Reconstruction, you know, post-Civil War, we had for one time 12 years of a multiracial democracy where we actually had a diverse set of people elected to the Congress. We had representation by Black and brown folks in our country. And then after those 12-year period, there was the redemption period where they actually removed those folks in office and created the Black codes and Jim Crow, and really undermined the ability to have a diverse set of people leading and making decisions in our country. And I see this period of time is really similar to that retraction period, where we're trying to ensure, you know, that there is people who either have wealth, what one might say are the oligarchs in the world, to continue to control the political apparatus and to continue to have that kind of power and sway in our politics and in our economy. So those are the things that really concern us as Dēmos, as we think about the work we're trying to do over the next decade. Is really, if Dēmos means the people. So what is it that we can do to really change the systems that have favored corporations and the wealthy, that they have outsized political and economic influence over the system? How can we, you know, arrest that and really put power in the hands of the Dēmos, of the people? So that's something that post this election and you know, years to come, we will continue to think about what are the systemic changes that we need within our democracy and economy to really ensure that, you know, to me, and I'll stop after this, as I think about the 2-decade demographic shift, and that demographic shift has been used as a fear-mongering tactic. You know, America is projected to be the majority of people of color by 2024. I mean, 2023. In some places, they're already a demographic majority in certain states, and particularly in our education system, children of color make up the majority in many states today. So we know this demographic shift is happening. But at the same time of this demographic shift, what's the phrasing that, you know, democracy does not equal destiny? You know, just because we will have a demographic majority of non-white people in the US does not mean that they will have the kind of political or economic power to yield anything. Quite frankly, the financial trends or the economic trends are that the majority of Black and brown people will have negative net wealth in the next 2 decades. So what will that mean for our economy? So those are the things that I'm keeping my eye out for over the trajectory of where we're headed. What are the things incrementally that we need to do, but what's the transformative vision that we need to have for our democracy to ensure that everyone has full political participation, no matter where they live. And I think this is the point I wanted to pivot to you, since you're sort of ACL writ large, but also New Jersey. Is this challenge between sort of states' rights and the state constitutions and the federal government's role to actually stem or create national standards? I think that's a really important part as we think about it. What are you concerned?
What am I concerned about? All of those things. You know, I want to pick up on a couple of threads that you mentioned. One is on immigration and immigrants' rights. You know, as we saw during the first Trump administration, there was chaos in our immigration system. There was the Muslim ban and family separation as formal policies of the administration that led to many families being torn apart. We at the ACLU were able to be ready for some of it, and be able to fight back on multiple levels and multiple fronts, and we were successful. And you know, it wasn't just the ACLU nationally, it was the ACLU in New Jersey and my state colleagues across the country that were pushing back. You know, we took on many immigration related issues, and litigation matters in New Jersey. One class action case that I can think of, it's not that far away from here, a group of Indonesian Christians that had come to the United States and settled in Middlesex County and lived there for decades. And they had all been, you know, applicants for asylum, and they, one reason or another, their applications did not prevail, and they were here and they were undocumented, and they had final orders of removal against them. They had negotiated an agreement with ICE that said basically that they were able to stay in this country as long as they routinely checked in with ICE, and they were doing so religiously year after year. And they would be granted what's called a stay of removal. They were able to stay in the country and not be removed. Long story short, the Trump administration comes in January of 2018. They decide to go after some low-hanging fruit communities. Here you had an insular community that was that had made themselves known as being undocumented because they were trying to do the right thing. But in the time that they were here, they had children here who are American citizens. They have extended family. They have communities through their church and other ways, and they you know, have rooted themselves with jobs and all of that, and were part of the fabric of the community. But ICE decided to go after some of those activities. They basically picked them up and made them disappear. Like, they threw them in detention. Nobody heard from them. This whole community decided to take sanctuary in a church. We learned of it, ran over to the church with three of my lawyers, and I had paralegals and a law firm that we were working with. We interviewed everybody in the church. Over the course of a day and a half, built a class action lawsuit, filed it, and we were ready for argument that day, thankfully, because the judge wanted argument that day. And we were able to get a restraining order against the government from removing these people and got the two men that were arrested out of jail. The good thing is that to this date, and I'll fast forward the story, to this date, everybody in that class is still in this country. We were able to, you know, pair each individual up, it was like 70 people, each individual up with a lawyer of their own to reopen their cases. Many of them were granted the asylum that they were seeking, and they've been able to stay. Now, I say that as an example because it is a taste of what we got in the first Trump administration. I think a second will be far more nefarious in its approach, and it will be a lot of course, chaos, but I think it'll be decentralized chaos. I think there's going to be a lot of potential, you know, localized actions that the federal government will take on, and some of it's outlined in front. Other issues that I'm thinking about, you know, on the immigrants' rights front, I'll just say this. You know, we know what we're getting with Trump. I think the some of the rhetoric that the Harris campaign and Democrats have been using is problematic as well. You know, the sort of doubling down on investments in law enforcement and talking about being the prosecutor from a border state, right? Like, I get why some of this works politically for folks, but you know, actually, I don't get why, because I don't actually know if it does, because we did some polling at the ACLU that suggests that people want proven, passionate solutions. They don't necessarily want the fear mongering and the doubling down of investment in law enforcement that tears people apart. People overwhelmingly, and I can share the results of our poll, people overwhelmingly want proven solutions, and they want things like a pathway to citizenship. They want things like opportunities for people who are undocumented. They don't want to see families separated. And so, you know, talking about, from both the Democrats and the Republicans, talking about it from a perspective of increasing law enforcement presence that will inevitably have a family separation element to it is heartbreaking and not what the public wants. And it's sort of disingenuous to suggest that it does. Other issues that I'm thinking about are what you mentioned, the big lie, right? The idea that there's a significant portion of our population that believes it's okay to challenge election results and sort of suggest that or be adamant about the idea that the loser is the winner. And I think that's a scary thing for our democracy for a number of reasons. It's obviously it diminishes the integrity of our democracy. It diminishes the idea that people have a say, and it is harmful for a number of reasons. Other issues that I'm thinking about I'll include the way we're talking about abortion in this country. Would be as we saw during the debates, the potential Trump administration. It seems like Trump just says whatever is convenient on abortion. It seems like there is more to work with on abortion with the Democrats. However, I will say even in a state like New Jersey, and Brandon knows this a little bit, even in a state like New Jersey, it's hard to get our lawmakers to talk about things like abortion. It's hard to get our lawmakers to be on the front lines of protecting reproductive freedom for all. It is not as slam dunk as folks might think it is in a state like Jersey, and so what I'm hoping for is that states will take the lead. And to get to your point about the federal and state, divergence, I should say. The federal Constitution protects a lot, right? Like there is the right to equal protection. There's a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. There's the right to due process. There are state constitutions across all of the states in the United States. New Jersey's is one of those strongest state constitutions, and it's been interpreted to have far more protections than the federal constitution offers. And what I would encourage folks to think about in this room is viewing the federal constitution and the Bill of Rights and the doctrine of each as the floor, not the ceiling. And states have the opportunity to actually expand and advance constitutional rights. And Justice Brennan said this in New Jersey at a conference before the Bar Association when he talks about states as laboratories. And he said, we have the ability through the state Supreme Court to protect rights and liberties, and I'm paraphrasing him and butchering it, but to protect rights and liberties in a way that the federal courts cannot. And so as we are in this moment, I want to ask you a question about the state, but we're in this moment where we maybe cannot rely on the Supreme Court of the United States to protect our rights and expand our rights. Perhaps state courts are the way to go to do so. And in New Jersey, we happen to have a great state Supreme Court that takes a rights expansive view on its doctrine, and that's really exciting. We're privileged at the ACLU of New Jersey to be one of the most frequent litigators before the state Supreme Court. We appear before the state Supreme Court more than any other party other than the government itself, and we make up about a third of its docket routinely. Even at the ACLU nationwide, the New Jersey practice is seen as a model, and as the ACLU nationwide is thinking about pivoting to a state court strategy, and you can read more about that online. New Jersey is seen sort of as the gold standard, both in terms of the court itself, but also the work that we get to do. But as you think about the Supreme Court of the United States, I was reading your website earlier, and the Supreme Court of the United States has rolled back rights, right? The fall of Roe, right? Affirmative action. Some of the decisions that hinge on tyranny, right? Like allowing for presidents to not be held accountable. Some of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act and the issues of democracy, and there's so many other things that we can talk about that this Supreme Court has failed to protect or proactively diminished. What are some of the things that you are leading and doing in your contemplation of the Supreme Court, and where we are as a society that perhaps cannot rely on the Supreme Court to protect the most marginalized among us.
That's such a great question. I mean, and to your point, you know, whether or not the judicial branch should be the Supreme Court ability to provide the kind of checks and balances, right, for the federal government, but to also uphold the Constitution, where, quite honestly, to your point, the Constitution gives us some basic, you know, liberties and freedoms, but states have much more ability to have. I love your point about that. And I think our concern obviously is the, you know, retraction from precedents that we've seen, you know, things that have typically been allowable or, you know, justified based on constitutionality, all of a sudden now, you know, don't have standing. And that is deeply concerning. And it also, you know, you think about whether or not then the court has been bought or co-opted by political ideology and rhetoric is, you know, where a lot of us believe that we cannot trust the ability of the Supreme Court to do its job outside of the political sphere. So, you know, a couple of the things that we've been supporting along with others in the sort of broad democracy coalition is around expanding the court. You know, the Constitution does not say or name how many jurors should be on the Supreme Court, so that gives some ability to advocate via Congress for additional seats to make the court more expansive, but also maybe more balanced. So that is one avenue. I know some people are concerned, well, depending on who's in office or what political, you know, then you can expand the court, expanding the court. But again, I think there is clear recognition that this court has been hijacked. And, you know, as we also think about sort of what is in line with where the public sentiment is, this court is outside of that. And so how do you reconcile sort of where sort of some of the populist movements and what people really believe in, want, and value are not being held by, you know, these jurors? So that's one. And then in terms of the ethics problems that have been exposed time and time again with, you know, people taking gifts and, you know, the impropriety that is seen by that, and the failure of these jurors to recuse themselves when there's a conflict of interest, all of those things. So there's a broad recognition that there needs to be ethics standards. Everyone else has a code of conduct that they operate by, and this court needs to be held accountable for this thing. So we are considering and supporting that for sure, if nothing else.
Yeah, for us, you know, the pivot to state courts is a big approach, right? So every, you know, like I said, the biggest strength of the ACLU is that we're present in every state, and so every state has a litigation practice at the ACLU, and there are several states that have relatively friendly state Supreme Courts that will take a rights expansive view, and that's something that we're sort of strategizing around. You know, one of the things that I wanted to ask before we run out of time is, let's like pivot to brass tacks. Like, what are the things that Dēmos is doing to prepare for some of these things? You know, what are some campaigns or projects that you're working on right now that you want to elevate in the space?
Yep, so we're part of many coalitions, but one of the biggest ones that we understand, regardless of what happens in November, is Congress is set to put forward HR 1 and 4, which is the Freedom to Vote and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So we've been a part of those conversations with the National ACLU to ensure that bill can move forward. And one of the big things that we talked about writ large is sort of from the think tank research groups like Dēmos is what kind of work do we need to do to create the record, the congressional record around the harms that we see state by state, on how some of these voter suppression tactics and practices at the state level are really creating barriers to access. And so that's something we will need to continue to do, particularly as we think about racial equity and racial justice. So that's one of the things we are focused on. One of the other things that, you know, as I think about the long game, there obviously, I would be remiss, Brandon, if I didn't talk about the reauthorization of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in January. This was the 2017 tax cut that President Trump passed, that really, based on the different provisions in that, created a huge windfall for the top 1%. I think of the income tax cut, 60% of the benefits went to people making more than $1 million. And there were other things that everyday folks like the child tax credit, you know, were able to see an increase in the amount of deduction that you could receive for your children. So that was beneficial for the middle class. But this bill is coming up for reauthorization, and there will be a huge conversation about whether or not we make permanent some of those corporate tax cuts. Ultimately, if any of those get renewed, we are looking at a cost of up to $4 trillion for 10 years if some of those income tax cuts to the top 1% or some of the corporate tax cuts continue on. So many of us in the advocacy community are really fighting for some of those to expire and not come back. But we do believe some of the provisions in there, like the child tax credit, which many of us believe the American Rescue Plan version of the CTC was much better. It increased from $2,000 to $3,600, $3,000 and $3,600, depending on how old your child was. And those that credit came to you monthly as opposed to, you know, during tax season. And we saw the rate of poverty for children decrease significantly, right? It was cut in half, right? And so here is where we are like, if we're going to reimagine tax policy in this country, and there's a long list of resources to talk about why the tax code in and of itself is a very racist tool, and where the sort of genesis of tax policy came from, and who was carved out, and who had benefits, has a very strong systemic racism piece of it. So we know that this tool has been used to actually continue to perpetuate wealth inequality in this country. And so we would be remiss if we don't get involved in that fight. So that's one of the bigger ones coming up that Dēmos will be engaging in as well.
Great, so looking forward to watching all of that unfold. I think it's time now to open it up for some questions, is that right? Okay, if there are questions in the room, I welcome them. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing all you have from your perspective, especially going into this election. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about government transparency as you're looking into this election, and particularly in New Jersey, as I know that there was efforts to kind of like make it very difficult to request information from the government, like the Okra system and things like that. So could you talk about what the situation is looking like in New Jersey and what you
I'll take that. The situation is looking dire. I'll say that. Brandon often talks about how New Jersey has one of the worst democracies in our country. That bill, which was mentioned, so there's something called the Open Public Records Act in New Jersey, which allows for freedom of information for regular everyday New Jerseyans to get access to public records. The legislature decided to essentially gut the law and limit access to public records. There are some exceptions, but really what's going to happen as a result is that powerful people will be able, like big companies, will be able to access records. Everyday individuals will not. And there is oftentimes in the law, there is a threat of potential legal action against people that are asking too many times, that are, suggesting that they're suggesting that there could be a consequence to asking for public records. There's also this attorney fee shifting provision. So traditionally, in the previous version of the law, you would get attorney's fees for if you were unreasonably denied public records. They have changed that to make it discretionary. So it's not guaranteed now that you will get attorney's fees. And so try finding an attorney that's going to want to take a controversial public records case when they're not guaranteed that they're gonna be compensated for their time. It's gonna leave it to organizations like mine or, you know, other pro bono lawyers to be able to take those cases. That's gonna drastically limit the ability to hold our government accountable. So what Brandon talks about, New Jersey being one of the worst democracies, yes, there are ways we see that in our ballot structure and in our voting rights. This public records piece is crucial to that too. I think New Jersey has fallen a rung when it comes to democracy as a result of our public records law. And to be sure, we're worse than so many other states. Like, it's not like this is just consistent across states. You know, there are other states that tried to do what New Jersey has done, but because of pushback, they killed the effort, right? And we have less transparency in our state than Florida, right? We have less transparency in our state than Alabama. And I think that's a real problem for multiple reasons, including the fact that we won't be able to hold our government accountable and journalists won't be able to do their job well. We already have a shrinking news environment in New Jersey, and to make it that much harder for them to work is, I think, detrimental to all of us. The good thing is that there are organizations like mine that are looking out for potential, potential sorts of opportunities to make sure that we build on the loss and find ways to make sure that we are we are advocating for more transparency every step of the way. So one of the things that we're working on includes transparency of police disciplinary history records, disclosing when there is a police officer that has been disciplined for a variety of different reasons. The idea is that pretty much every other industry has some public accountability. So, I'm a lawyer. If there's a complaint against me or some sort of action taken against me, that will be a public record. Hairstylists, manicurists, other plumbers, like licensed professionals in New Jersey, all have this record through the Attorney General's websites. For police, it's not the same, and they're the ones that can escalate situations and cause harm and kill people. And so I think it's really important that we see who it is that is running and working in our police forces. There are other things like that that we're working on, and we're trying to embolden transparency in New Jersey. But I think the bill that passed that guts the Public Records Act is a real problem, and I encourage all of you to reach out to your lawmakers and tell them how disappointed you are that the bill moved, and we need to bring back the full version of the Public Records Act.
And I would just add on, there's some work that we're going to do is sort of doing some landscape scan around direct democracy. One of the pillars of our power agenda, which is all about building economic and political power for the people, is a responsible, accountable government pillar. And that's some of our work will be around politics and decreasing corporate power and influence. Two is around the court reform work, but the other is how can we expand more sort of direct democracy initiatives in states. You all are a ballot initiative state, right? So that's one of the ways.
No, we're not.
Oh, okay, so that's one of the ways.
Yeah.
And citizen assemblies, which give more power to people. To your point about just the transparency aspect of this, and then one of the other maybe more popular is the participatory budgeting process. To get people to be able to review and see how dollars are being spent and hold accountable. So those are some of the ways, again, to get citizens the way into the government, so that there's more transparency.
We have 10 minutes left, so if you have some questions.
You go first, really.
Thank you all for providing your insights and experiences. So I'm curious, Taifa, for having worked in different states and Amol having grown up here. New Jersey has a pretty unique apparatus in our political world of county committee chairs. So I'm curious how your advocacy efforts in your organizations are kind of retrofitted to address that and navigating the county committees that we have to, that are often, the most powerful entities in a lot of ways when it's coming to moving through policy, and how that differentiates from other states as well.
Sure. I don't think the ACLU of New Jersey is retrofitted to the apparatus. I think, you know, we're trying to lead in this state and make it an inclusive democracy for all. Where we see points of exclusion and where people aren't able to participate in our democracy, we call it out, right? And we tell it like it is, and we pride ourselves on being honest brokers. And we've been able to, you know, for 65 years now, you know, continue to endure and outlive any political moment. But to your point, we have the system we have, and in a lot of ways, it's a rigged system, where the biggest holders of power are those folks that you mentioned. And one of the areas where we recently litigated was related to what's called the ballot line, or the primary, you know, the county line or the primary ballots. Folks might know this concept, but it's basically a way for you know, the party chairs to be able to identify who it is that they want to endorse and keep them all together in one line. And if there are other, say, Democrats on a Democratic Party ballot, they might be in what people call ballot Siberia. And so when the regular, everyday average voter goes to vote, they might see that the Mercer County Democrats endorses this line of people and think, okay, I'm just gonna vote down the line, and everybody else is sort of an outlier. And so the structure of the ballot so often determines who it is that gets elected. The question is, do voters then have a real say? Like, do they actually have a choice, or is this diminishing the right of your, the power of your vote? And we think that it's actually infringing on voting rights. And so we were like, and a number of other folks were a part of this litigation that was led by Andy Kim and his campaign related to the line. And of course, there were other litigation that I should give credit where it's due, that was brought many years before Andy Kim. But that didn't get the same sort of traction and movement in the courts the way Andy Kim's litigation did. And we submitted an amicus brief along with many other partners that did as well. And a federal court held and an author affirmed that the line infringes on candidates' rights, and it is something that needed to be you know, put to bed in the last election, in the last primary election, which was held earlier this summer. And so going forward, I think, you know, that decision applied to the line for this go around, for the Democratic Party line. There was a recent decision that had to do with both Republican and Democratic parties ballots, and they're going forward, even if those decisions were narrow. I think politically the line should be a thing of the past, because now there's so much more awareness of the line, and so much more so much more awareness of how our democracy is hindered by it. So I'll say, you know, to more directly answer your question, you know, we don't play by their rules. We call it out when we see it hindering our rights, and we win, right? So and sometimes we lose, but it's a long fight, and we have a long arc in mind. But you know, being an honest broker and leading an organization that is you know, pro-democracy and advocating for the people means that you got to tell the truth sometimes, and all the time. And it's a privilege and a responsibility.
And I would just add, as a national organization, we're not equipped to be able to get to that level of sort of who the power brokers are. I know many of my colleagues who run national power building organizations do a lot of power mapping. And so then you see, you know, whether or not it's the administration versus the state legislature, and then who might be other power brokers in a state like New Jersey that are wielding a lot of power in terms of like what the local policies are that are impacting people's lives, whether it's housing, wages, those sorts of things. But yeah, we just aren't equipped to get to that granularity of the power and moving the shapes. But I think that's something that's really important. So thank you for that.
That's my question.
I'm often thinking about sort of like the importance, obviously, of making systemic changes, but also the importance of individual interventions, like on a level. So I'm just wondering like what sort of individual interventions you could recommend for people to be taking this time.
As far as engaging in
Yeah.
like the fight and the work,
Correct,
the work,
yeah.
as we say,
Yeah.
in the nonprofit speak, the work. If you, given where are you students or faculty or staff, I think there's a way that we can all engage in our own personal capacity, right? I get to wake up every day and do this work and get paid to lead an organization that thinks about constantly this intersection of economic justice and democracy reform. I am blessed and privileged to be able to do that. But in my personal capacity to be able to, do some phone banking, to, if you have a candidate that you care about or just want to do general civic engagement work, who's a local organizing entity in this community that you can help get people, well, the day's almost over, national registration and voter registration day, but just to do some of those things to engage. I also think volunteering and local nonprofits who are doing some of this civic engagement work is really important. I think also doing research and writing within your community, because so often we don't get to hear voices and perspectives of the people. As a researcher and sort of a think tanker, I can write reports all day, and I've taken them to the Georgia legislature in my career, and I've had the majority leader in the state house in the house in Georgia say to me, Taifa, I would really appreciate this research, but I haven't heard from my constituents on this. So I would just say each and every one of us is a constituent, and we have a lawmaker or council person or county commissioner that represents us. How do we make sure our views and perspectives are heard by those leaders?
Echo that and sign off on it, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the word hope. Because the title of this talk is Hope as a Policy Priority. Let's close with this. What's a line or a word on hope for the future? Tell me what gives you hope right now.
I said this to some folks at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation yesterday when we were talking about tax policy. And I said the mere fact that post-COVID, we saw political will and public will line up, and we had abundance. So there were policies that were passed to make sure people were healthy, that they had money in their pockets, that their kids were safe. When we have that kind of alignment where the public is aligned with those who are representing us, we can solve problems. So that's what gives me hope in this moment.
You struck a thought with me, which is I also said something to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation last week, or Brandon was too. What gives me hope right now is that I read an article a few weeks ago about the number of immigrants that are becoming new citizens right now. They're applying in droves. It's the highest number and level ever in the history of our country. Over 100,000 people every month are becoming new citizens. And the primary reason they want to do this is because they want to vote in this election. That gives me hope. My mother did the same thing in 2016 after living in this country for 42 years. She became a US citizen in 2016 because she saw it as her duty to vote in the 2016 election. Of course, she wanted to vote for what she thought would be the first woman president of the United States, because that was very important to her. We saw what happened, but she's voted in every election since, even the odd year elections, which we have in New Jersey, right? And so that gives me hope, and I'm grateful for communities like this one and the power of the Dēmos. Well, thank you so much.
I just want to thank Taifa and Amol, especially for New Jersey. Yes, we have the presidential election coming up, but regardless of what happens in the presidential, we are the first state along with Virginia to get to respond next year in the gubernatorial election. And because of the changes on the ballot line and other things that are happening, New Jersey's kind of at the cusp of a democratic sprint. Right? We have the opportunity to really increase voter engagement, civic participation, having the power of our vote matter in a way that it never has before, but not people don't take advantage of it. So thank you for being interested in the topic and for being here today. And please, a round of applause to our participants.